Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Kember. Today's episode is going to be a doozy, so strap in. Today, I will be talking about the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget. The leader of the OMB, as it stands today, is one of the chief architects of Project 2025, Russ Vought. Sticking with the themes seen throughout Project 2025, the OMB is setting up for a massive and sprawling overhaul of how the US government hands out money to governmental agencies. In this video particularly, I will be talking about the impacts to scientific researchers, particularly as it relates to the biomedical sciences, since that is my forte. The OMB says that these proposed rule changes, which mind you don't require congressional approval, will supposedly usher in a new age of what the OMB calls gold standard science. However, I think that this characterization is extremely ironic, as I hope you will also be able to understand for yourself by the end of this video. These proposed rules will fundamentally change how research is conducted in the United States by letting the final authority for handing out grant money be settled by political appointees instead of scientists. When these rule changes are passed, they will cause indiscriminate damage to the American people, to American scientists, and to the American government, all of which will be perpetrated by the negligence and short sightedness that this proposal brings to the table. Some people may believe that the ivory tower of academia has been taking government money for too long, but there are countless examples of academic research yielding actionable improvements to ordinary civilians' lives. It is scary to be living through a time where academic censorship is seeming more and more real by the day. With the signing of the OMB's new rules, the shift in research could happen as early as October 1st. It is important that we stay vigilant and aware of our freedoms being stripped away from us. So, as the kind soul I am, I've been watching the escalations of academic censorship for you and will summarize as concisely as possible. To learn about the new changes upcoming for research grants, join me as I talk to you about what even is a government grant to begin with, and then diving into what are the actual proposed changes proposed by the OMB, and how will these changes impact your daily life and science as a whole. Next, I will talk about why we should fear the increasing push to privatize scientific ventures and why we should seek to keep science nonpartisan and publicly funded. Lastly, I will pull back the curtain on academia and talk about my experience applying to graduate PhD programs and government grants last year. I'll talk about the process of finding my place in the scientific field and identifying how personally I've already seen cracks in academic research. Cracks which could lead to the decline of new American researchers being minted and the recognition of the United States as the academic powerhouse of the world. All of that and more is a part of today's episode, so I hope you join me in talking about the destruction of American science. So, what even are government grants and why are they important? Basically, the grants are just checks signed by the government to support whatever action they see fit in improving the country. So, for example, federal grants can cover veterans' benefits as well as medical costs for people that are using Medicare, small business grants, discretional funding for agriculture, Pell Grants, and many others are all such examples of ways that our federal government grants money to a sprawling diversity of sectors within our country. Of those sectors, one of them is academic research. And in academia, grants are basically just lump sums of money which are given out to researchers after they win grant proposals from governmental agencies like the National Institute of Health or the National Science Foundation, to name a few. Research topics can range from geology to sociology to medical sciences to engineering, basically everything under the sun. So, when a researcher wants to study something new, they will submit a proposal to a governmental agency, and then three peers in a similar field or with a similar field of expertise will overview their proposal and rank it for its merits and its shortfalls. Only the best ideas are given funding. Apart from funding, which is won through various government agencies, private sources like research institutes, pharmaceutical companies, and even university specific grants can also fund research. However, these are in the minority compared to federal funding, which funds research. Research grants not only pay for the salaries of the PhD students, but a lot of the times also for the salaries of postdoctoral researchers. These grants are also a source of money that the PhD students and postdoctoral researchers use to buy supplies to conduct whatever experiments it is they want to do. In the biomedical sciences, it's not uncommon for top universities or the professors at those universities to be sitting on millions of dollars of grant money, which basically goes towards funding all of their employees or researchers, funding all of the buying of lab materials, as well as maintaining the lab, all of such expenses and much more. But all you need to know for now is that grant money is what allows for new research to be produced. This academic grant money and other forms of federal grants are given out on the expectation that this gifted money will produce a higher return for the United States in the end. Most research isn't very profitable, but discoveries like penicillin, which brought about a scientific revolution, is why we keep funding basic science research in the first place. There is still so much more to be discovered about the human condition. Anyways, in 2024, the totality of all veterans, Medicare, research, Pell Grants, etc., all of the grants added up totaled $1.1 trillion in spending. Outside of this $1.1 trillion figure, biomedical research funding makes up only $50 billion of that total grant expenditure. This $50 billion accounts for most of the funding for academic science going on right now in universities, among those private contributions that I mentioned earlier as well. In the coming years, the government's grant budget could climb past $2 trillion. Consistently, grants account for roughly 17% of all federal expenditure per year. Crucially, the 17% of America's budget, which funds biomedical science among a host of many other things, could soon be held hostage by the newly proposed OMB rules. So let's not delay any further and let's get into these proposed rule changes. The OMB released their proposal in late May, shocking the scientific community. This ruling was 400 pages long, and ain't nobody got time for that. So we're going to be looking at an article written up by Dr. Janetsky instead, who summarizes these rule changes. Dr. Janetsky is a former senior program officer at the National Institute of Health and worked there for 20 plus years before resigning recently. And she kindly summarized for us 19 ways in which the OMB is going to destroy the ability for researchers to study science in the United States. So let's just hop straight into number one, which is potentially the most blatant and bizarre rule change that wants to be implemented by the OMB, which is they want political appointees to oversee all new grant proposals so that they can ensure that all science being funded, quote, demonstrably advances the president's policy priorities, end quote. Nothing says we love science like only allowing for the study of government sanctioned research topics. This means that should a researcher submit a proposal and the peer reviewers like it and agree that this science is worth doing, political appointees have the ultimate say in what new science gets funded now. Number two, peer review is no longer binding. As I mentioned prior, peer review is one of the pillars of truth in the scientific field. It is notoriously hard for scientists to agree on stuff, so when they do, such as when reviewers are looking over a stellar research proposal, for example, that is a stamp of approval that says this idea is worth testing. Likewise, when you finish your project and are showing your final results to publishers and peer reviewers, it is also difficult to have agreement on the results, the quality of the results, the implication of the results, and what have you. But with these newly proposed rule changes, though, what would happen is that political appointees could now override scientists' opinions and hand out grants to subpar applicants or subpar ideas that peer reviewers had already deemed not worthy of entertaining or funding. The new authority in town is aligning with the president's priorities, not scientific consensus. Number three, gold standard science. As you probably noticed in the thumbnail of this video, I have a rocket titled Gold Standard Science heading towards a hospital, NIH, NSF, and Harvard's logo, along with some, let's say, concerned onlookers as well. While the OMB casually whips around the term gold standard science many times in this manifesto, they actually never define this term in any substantive way in any of these 400 pages. If I had to guess, I would assume this term symbolizes the switch from science, as it has been done since ever, to the new era where you can get called on by the president or one of his appointees to support whatever outlandish theories that are indefensible. Research integrity doesn't matter anymore to the president. All you need to do is use your credentials to confirm the president's belief that vaccines are bad, and you'll get handsomely rewarded with grant money out the wazoo because you, the totally unbiased researcher, are totally going to get all the resources and everything you ever want and dream if you just say what Mr. President wants to hear. This term is being used as a setup. The president only wants gold standard science. What does that mean? We don't know. But crucially, the president knows gold standard science when he sees it, so we'll just trust him on that. Number four, and now we're really getting into the juicy stuff. Your grant can get canceled at any time and for any reason. As I mentioned, not only do grants fund the cost of the materials and instruments used, they also pay the researchers' salaries most of the time. So, if a PhD student that is working on their thesis is supported by a singular grant, they are one slash away from pausing their project indefinitely, as well as pausing the transfer of their biweekly paycheck to their account indefinitely until the time that they find another funding source, which, just FYI, grant cycles run for months at a time, so one does not easily find another grant should their current grant suddenly get canceled. Even though that student's grant got approved by a governmental agency like NIH or NSF in the past and made it through the rigors of peer review, this decision can be completely reverted by political appointees when they look at your proposal again and deem that it doesn't align with the president's priorities of gold standard science close enough. Number five, no DEI ever anywhere, no gender research, and neither of those will get your grant approved ever forever. Even if you have a nonprofit program somewhere on your university that isn't paid for in any way by federal government grants, if that nonprofit has some DEI element to it, then your university is no longer eligible for federal grant funding. Strikingly, we already saw foreshadowing of this earlier last year when we saw $2 billion of Harvard's grant money being frozen because of their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. This case, among many others I'll talk about later, show how this administration has actually been teasing these rules to the American public for a while now, but they are just now trying to implement all of these in one go. Alongside banning gender research, there will most likely also be bans for research on women, the global climate, and vaccines, among other viewpoints not deemed as important by the president. And as an incel, you might be thinking to yourself, is it really worth studying women or doing gender research? And the truth is, of course it is. Studying endocrinology doesn't happen in a sexual vacuum. And what I mean by that is studying male sex hormones and female sex hormones benefits both sexes. For example, new research could highlight previously unknown pathways in which hormones interact with your body and studying the gender specific basis of disease. Because as we know, some diseases, they do discriminate and they target some sexes more often than another, and it will be interesting to understand why. Our endocrine systems exert great influence on our body and our cellular environment. However, the full process for how this happens is very complex and still yet fragmented. There is still much to learn about how hormones interact with cancers and promote development, But it seems like the president wants to close the doors on this promising research avenue prematurely for whatever reason, although I can surely tell you that it is not a scientific one. Number six, absolutely do not talk to other scientists around the world. So, you know how science is built on the pillars of peer review and taking diverse opinions into account so that you can come to a sort of conclusion which achieves consensus among many researchers? Yeah, how about we keep doing that, but no longer talk to anybody who isn't American because it's for national security? If we are to believe the OMB is serious about cutting ties with the rest of the academic world, let's look at the potential consequences of that. The US government uses grant money to fund agencies like those which track near satellite collisions in space. There are roughly 75 of these near satellite misses every day, so we are teetering on the edge of catastrophe daily. Because of that, these agencies will communicate with other countries' agencies to make sure that our satellite data aligns with theirs so we can effectively perform evasive maneuvers with satellites should that be necessary, and so that these satellites don't crash into each other and become space debris. But apparently, this stuff is no longer important anymore because on day one, these agencies would be barred from talking to any other countries. And at this rate, most people have become reliant on satellites in facilitating their daily life. So, this potential gag order could severely complicate the lives of average Americans in ways so numerous and complex that it is difficult to understand the true nature of the calamity that would ensue if the US really shut itself away from the rest of the world like that. Another stupefying consequence is that some projects that go up to the International Space Station are paid for by federal grants. Well, as the name implies, the International Space Station is an international vessel. So follow me here. If you have a non American in the International Space Station while an NIH funded project is going on, what is supposed to happen at that point? Because if we are to, I guess, follow the president's instincts, I would think that he would want us to chuck the foreign scientists out the airlock because only Americans are able to witness the raw awesomeness of American science. Funnily enough, this proposed rule couldn't come at a greater time for this administration since Ebola is flaring up again. Despite this, there's pretty shoddy coverage of what's going on right now, partly because epidemiologists are already having their hands tied. The United States recently pulled out of the World Health Organization for some reason, so now American scientists are out of the loop with how Ebola is spreading. But not only that, our government is actively banning scientists from even trying to reach out to current WHO scientists to help understand how Ebola is spreading. Should banning international cooperation among scientists be successful, there is only upside for this administration, as it would almost too perfectly steer people's attention from a crisis that was started when the Department of Government Efficiency slashed various government programs. Importantly, Doge cut USAID, which arguably is the reason why Ebola sprouted up in Africa again in the first place. The only reason that this gag order is scheduled to become law is because the truth is becoming inconvenient to domestic and international policy. And instead of doing the hard work to fix governance, we are building an echo chamber where only gold standard science can be studied. Don't listen to other experts. And in fact, if you have a question, just ask the president because he knows way more about science than you. And to add even more insult to injury, if this rule passed, it would mean that 50% of clinical trials, that being life saving drugs which are currently being tested for safety, would be cut short just because American scientists are collaborating with non Americans in half of these ongoing clinical trials. It's really humorous to think that achieving gold standard science is by closing America off from the rest of the world and doing the complete opposite of what happened in World War II. Just a history lesson to remind you guys, in World War II, the US was basically poaching scientists from all across Europe, and crucially, this likely led to the success of the Manhattan Project, among many other things. This is a drastic simplification, but America certainly prospered by letting European talent create American discoveries. But don't worry, folks. The president is a master of history and knows this stuff. So, tactfully, he will no longer allow any American scientist to talk to anyone else and will exclude all foreign nationals from adding to American science dominance. Here in the US, we only like smart people, but they have to be American and fully on board with following the president's agenda for gold standard science. Number seven, domestic research only. If you want to collaborate with any foreigner in a university that isn't from America, you better hope your political appointee also likes your collaborators, or else it will not get approved. Number eight, we can stalk you and disfavor certain people who don't align with the president's agenda. If you happen to be a part of a climate change activist group, or perhaps even show up to the wrong side of an Israel Palestine protest, that can be used against you when you are trying to apply for grant money. Number nine, as if the websites you use to apply for grants aren't ancient and time consuming enough, let's also make a massive database of every person who ever interacts with a governmental agency ever and waste more of their time with bureaucratic chores. Also, let's have the Department of Homeland Security run it all because why not? Number 10, all of the agencies that make up the US government are now under financial control of the OMB and are steered by the will of the OMB and the desire of the president. Yes, people, you heard that right. The EPA, FDA, NIH, NSF, pick a governmental agency. All of them will be run by political appointees now, controlling around a fifth of all money that the government spends in a year. Number 11, you need to guess the future, I guess. If you are a researcher and you want to go to a conference to share your work and get feedback from other scientists, usually grant money covers those such expenses. These new proposed rules, however, would make that more difficult. You see, the OMB wants you to get pre-approval at the time of your award for which conferences you are expecting to go to. Since, you'll know which conference you'll want to attend as you're writing up the application for work you have not yet started. And for those people that didn't think years ahead and let the OMB know 3 years in advance they wanted to go to the annual Biochemical Society meeting, I guess you'll have to pay for that trip out of pocket or something, I guess. If it wasn't enough to ban American scientists from talking to the outside world, we now can't even read the science from journals from the outside world and should consider paying for subscriptions from America only journals, which publish work that is created by Americans. Scientists would have to ask for approval to use their own grant money to access journals that they would use to develop their own novel experiments. Make it make sense. Number 13, publication costs are no longer allowable. This might be surprising, but when scientists publish research papers, not only are there peer reviewers, usually volunteer positions that professors just willingly accept to do for free, but the researcher who wants to publish their work also has to pay the journal to publish their work. Usually, this cost, which is a couple of $1,000s, comes from grant money, but apparently, grants will no longer provide money for researchers to publish their work, and researchers will have to cover that cost out of pocket, same as attending conferences. And if you want to publish a paper that is open access, meaning that it wouldn't require a subscription to that journal to be read, you better fork up even more money for that. Because it isn't stressful enough to be making 35 to 50 grand at the high end as a PhD student. And mind you, that 50 grand is to live in areas like Berkeley or New York. And on top of all of that, making those types of wages, you are expected to set aside a couple $1,000s to publish your own findings at the end of your PhD thesis. Because sure, setting aside a couple grand in a job that doesn't pay super well and where you are heavily discouraged or in some cases banned from taking up a second job will go over super well. This all sure sounds like gold standard science diplomacy to me. 14, and maybe the most scary of all, scientists better be careful when they speak to the press and say something that doesn't align with the president's priorities. If you dare get any federal grant money and talk about your own research topics in a public way that isn't approved by the government will get you and cancel your grant funds. So, for example, I guess me talking about my research into scorpion toxins, a totally benign research topic which most no one will ever come across or even find interesting, is suddenly becoming a top secret government operation, and I should exercise caution when I'm talking about the potential alternatives to surgical anesthetics. Even more alarmingly, though, we have already seen this happen with gagging of researchers that are way more influential and prominent than myself getting arrested at this year's American Diabetes Association conference. At this ADA conference, 5 individuals got arrested for handing out an editorial that was critical of the government, particularly in regards to the way research is being treated currently. These researchers warned that it seems like diabetes research funding will continue to get slashed unless something changes. These weren't just nobody Joe Schmo scientists saying this either. I'm talking Stephen Kahn, the editor in chief himself of Diabetes Care, the prominent journal which publishes all things diabetes research. This editor, among 4 other decorated researchers, were arrested for handing out these pamphlets since apparently they needed pre approval to hand them out. The ADA's leadership categorized their own prominent scientists' remarks as inflammatory and nonpartisan, and have since faced immense scrutiny for not apologizing to these scientists, among other ongoing scandals going on at the ADA. It's just funny that they arrested a group of researchers for being partisan, and their take is that if you cut diabetes research, millions of people will die from a disease which scientists are actively getting better at treating. Wegovy and Ozempic are great examples of better treatment options than in year pasts, and given more time, I'm sure there'll be greater strides in diabetes care, but certainly not if you disfavor to fund research. That apparently is a woke idea nowadays, and as I said, this whole kerfuffle led to the arrest of 5 researchers whose sole goal was to show their opposition to cutting NIH funding. Number 15, if you receive any grant money, we reserve the right to limit your free speech about certain sensitive political topics. Yet again, very similar to some of the themes we've already seen. 16, any new grant agencies that are created need to follow the president's standard of gold standard science. 17, agencies are able to set up grants which are not publicly listed. So, in other words, it would be possible for these agencies to hide money from public view. This means, in theory, the OMB can hand feed grants to scientists who bend the knee to the president's ideals most honorably. Number 18, any scientific or civil society related nonprofits that don't align with the president's view aren't able to get any grant money. And finally, 19, I'm sure it won't surprise you at this point. The OMB basically controls all of the grant funding system, and they don't care what systems were in place before. The OMB system of handing out money is the gold standard now. So, right after the OMB published these 19 new dystopian rules, there was a 45-day period where people could comment and voice any criticisms toward changing how money flows through our governmental agencies. Sadly, as of uploading this video, the public comment period already ended on July 13th. However, during the public comment period, many scientists voiced their criticism, myself included. To add to the dystopianness of this whole rule change and commenting on it, I got an email from a coordinator at my university, which, for the sake of the video, I won't disclose names or roles, but we were told that you should voice your criticism, but we're recommended to be careful to not overly expose your identity. Seeing with what the OMB wants to do with grant approvals, if they see that you disapprove of them, you could be in grave trouble should these proposed rule changes pass into law on the proposed date of October 1st. So, as I hope you have realized, these are extraordinarily controlling rules which aim to tire out scientists and basically just have them give in to all of the president's desires. And these are an assault on science, free speech, and the superiority of American science as a whole. The president is systematically dismantling public education and research so that we can start the transition to privatized education and research, which would be a truly grim future should he succeed indeed. You might ask, is public research really necessary? wouldn't it be easier on the government if private sources like research institutes or pharmaceutical companies just paid $50 billion a year to fund all academic research instead? Well, while that does seem smart on paper, there are lots of things that public research does that private research simply will not do for us. For example, from the years 2010 to 2019, the NIH spent around $187 billion on research that contributed towards the release of 354 of the 356 drugs that were released in that same time. In fact, 60 to 70% of research into basic sciences like cell biology phenomena is given through federal grant money. There simply isn't an appetite for these types of research areas by private grant organizations, since at the end of the day, most of them want to see a prompt return on their investment, and they don't want to wait many years for research to eventually bloom into multi billion-dollar industries. So, when private organizations like pharmaceutical companies do give out private grants, they're usually for promising compounds that have already been discovered by publicly funded basic science research. Once there is enough evidence to support that some compound could eventually become profitable and successfully pass through clinical trials, that is when private grants start to sprout up. And while private grants can facilitate research, these grants usually come with funding agreements, which include provisions on intellectual property, who owns the data from the experiments, and whether or not this work can become published or viewed by other researchers. So, private grants basically hinder fast follow up experiments and effectively lock ideas up with specific companies for periods at a time. In contrast, research which is conducted by public grants has way fewer strings attached to it and allows for ideas to flow much more freely between collaborators. So, while private grants can facilitate good research, at the end of the day, these private companies live in the realm of capitalism where they respond to their shareholders. So, because of this, it also makes sense that shareholders wouldn't exactly be happy if their company was sharing company data with competitors. So this makes it such that the reliance on private funds to fund science would slump progress, since you are singling scientists out to capitalize and commercialize ideas instead of letting everyone talk and come to a consensus and develop perhaps even a greater idea worth commercializing. To see how both public and private money can lead to successful new drugs, we can talk about the journey that Ozempic or Wegovy had before they were approved for sale. The original science that led up to these GLP-1 agonist medications was funded by public money from scientists working directly at NIH. These scientists were studying the venom of the Gila lizard and seeing how it impacted mouse pancreatic function. They found that exendin 4, a glucagon like peptide, or GLP, was responsible for creating increased insulin levels in the blood of mice once it interacted with pancreas. Many experiments were done afterwards to confirm these results, and this basic science research was basically all funded and done by the NIH in the late 80s and early 90s. And then once more was known, then eventually private funding funneled in toward the late 90s on this idea of GLP medications. These preliminary projects on Exendin 4, funded by federal money, could have easily cost many millions of dollars to conduct. And those millions of dollars could have just as easily produced another publication that is just quote unquote noise added to the cumulative pile of human knowledge. Instead, though, this work on Exendin 4 eventually stood out as a unique way to treat diabetes through a new class of drug, GLP-1 agonists. The idea of using glucagon like peptides to treat diabetes, which today is a market of roughly 60 to 70 billion dollars, was originally a multi-million dollar shot in the dark. No one could have foreseen GLP-1 agonists being worth as much as they are today, and surely you couldn't have predicted that GLP-1s might even show promise for treating some heart conditions and potentially even be able to treat substance use disorder. Only a madman would place money that studying lizard venom is a good idea, and that madman is the US government. A similar analogy to the shot in the dark is the development of lasers. Lasers, which beam information through fiber optic cables, are the basis for how we constructed and currently interact with the internet today. However, the discovery of lasers, which caused the subsequent development of the internet, came from pioneering quantum physicists 100 years ago who questioned whether the phenomena of stimulated emission, or essentially the where photons duplicate themselves to produce beams of light, is possible in the first place. This work was all carried out by academics testing the boundaries and interpretation of the newly developed framework of quantum mechanics. The researchers had nothing to gain other than just the love of discovery. Something crucial that you should take away from basic science is the fact that without hindsight, many of the inventions that came from basic science research are hard to trace back to their origin. For example, it is difficult to assume that someone could foresee the discovery of stimulated emission slash lasers, that this discovery would lead to the construction of the internet. In a similar way, it doesn't track that venom from a lizard could treat people with diabetes. These seemingly uncorrelated ideas all sprouted from academic work which has massively improved the quality of our lives, and there's no reason to believe that publicly funded science today won't produce the same returns. Now, while I'm not the biggest fan of private grants, private ventures are often the most common way that new drugs get introduced to the market for one simple reason: money. While public money is good at divide and conquer, let's get scientists to do their own thing and then they'll report back the exciting stuff they found, developing a new drug costs a lot of money. Like a lot. The average cost from the initial discovery of the candidate molecule and going through clinical trials, which usually takes a decade, give or take a couple years, and then finally passing through phase 3 clinical trials, and then finally being able to sell drug on the market. All of that in total usually combines to $1 billion that the company sinks in before they see any profits. This $1 billion is mainly attributed to the cost of clinical trials or human testing. After animal testing is done and testing in humans begins, then the costs really start to add up fast. You must keep in mind that these companies are paying professionals to run the trials, to collect the data, to provide the drug at no cost to the patients. And then in phase 3, where there could be potentially hundreds of people enrolled, this translates to a lot of human labor, which potentially could be crossing state lines and is potentially even in foreign countries as well. And all of this has to be done while ensuring safety standards required by the FDA for the passage of new drugs. Despite this enormous price tag, most drugs, roughly 60%, are developed by biotech startups that have less than $500 million in assets, which is roughly half of the amount of money they would need for the full $1 billion, which development of a drug usually costs. When you compare this to only 40% of drugs that are introduced to the market are actually coming from big pharmaceutical companies. The reason for this, we need to circle back to the idea of risk. Most biotech companies are, or startups, are spin-offs from academic work, and in some cases might be a passionate PhD student who had a really interesting research topic and could see some potential in using that research topic to expand treatment options for some medical condition. The development of companies fresh out of graduate school usually involve venture capital for funding, and this is a long, grueling process of around 10 years where researchers essentially get loaned the entirety of the $1 billion over the course of the lifetime of the company before the startup actually is profitable. And they are hoping that at some point their drug will be passed through the FDA and they will be able to collect some revenue and then at that point be able to pay the money back that it took to actually develop that drug. So the stakes when it comes to developing new drugs are huge. In fact, most biotech startups aren't even profitable, with 90% of them failing and the remaining contenders are usually getting bought out by big pharmaceutical companies who then add that treatment to their catalog of drugs that they produce. So if 90% of ideas flail and burn up, it seems reasonable that bigger companies are looking at their bottom line and are deciding that they would prefer to do less basic science to find new drugs, which is really expensive and time consuming. And they would instead like to expend effort to acquire companies that are near profitable instead. So, to summarize all of this, I will give you guys an analogy to set up how drug development works. In this analogy, you are a big pharmaceutical company panning for gold. You need a flowing river, which represents academia and the fresh flow of ideas coming from academia. In order for pharmaceutical companies to find gold, they need to use sieves or sieves, which are biotech startups, which sort through the most promising ideas to find gold separated from the mundane ideas or the dirt, which is hiding the gold in the river basin. If there's a steady flow of ideas or water down that river, you can sieve through more ideas, create more startups, and then pharmaceutical companies have more chances to acquire more gold or more startups, which leads to more drugs eventually being passed through the FDA. The academia, biotech, big pharma pipeline, as I would call it, is basically the standard for how drugs are developed nowadays to limit risk for big companies and to limit the amount of public money that goes into the expense that is developing new drugs. While private funds are usually the way that most treatments get approved and pass through the FDA, there are some rare cases where public money is actually essential to funding clinical trials, and that is when the drug benefits the population too much. And to understand what I mean by that, we have to talk about patent exclusivity. The oil that greases the metaphorical gears of the academia, biotech, big pharma pipeline is patents. Patents, when awarded, are basically giving a company 20 years to be the only manufacturer to produce a certain drug for a certain condition, loosely speaking. Crucially, these patents are usually handed out as companies are doing the work and finishing the initial studies before human trials can start. That means that if companies are lucky, they'll have 5 to 10 years of exclusivity left on their patents, and that will let them sell their drug at whatever cost is necessary to recoup their $1 billion loss they took up by doing clinical trials and trying to develop a new drug. They usually sell drugs at a markup, and to avoid opening the can of worms of price gouging in the pharmaceutical industry, I'll leave it at that. But this means that drugs that no longer have exclusivity are no longer of much interest to private investors. For example, let's say we are talking about ivermectin. This drug has no active patents, and in theory, anyone could make and sell it. Suppose then that ivermectin was shown to treat something unrelated to being an anti-parasitic drug initially. Let's say maybe it treated cancer, for example. In that case, private money likely won't flock to fund the clinical trials to test whether ivermectin can treat some cancers. The reason being is that once the trials are complete, then that drug still isn't exclusive and the profits would likely be marginal despite all of the money that has to be put into clinical trials to show that ivermectin is up to the task of treating cancer. And just to clarify, ivermectin does not treat cancer. But if it did, the only reason private money would get involved is if they could get a new patent, a new formulation of ivermectin, and giving them some sort of exclusivity so they could recoup the cost of the additional clinical trial needed to test ivermectin for treating cancer. If there was a generic drug out there that could reliably treat cancer, it would massively benefit consumers, but the producers would eat a lot of the cost that comes with the drug development without any patent exclusivity to use at the end to recoup costs. This makes generic drug clinical trials especially rare since they are usually funded with public money, meaning these opportunities come every blue moon since public funds are generally used for basic science, not launching new drugs which are more capital expensive. Um, Similar to generic drugs, vaccines are another important research topic that is held up by academia. For example, take this professor, Dr. Duoju, who is trying to develop new methods for making a universal Ebola virus vaccine. While this research is novel and it could improve how vaccines are designed in the future, vaccines aren't profitable. It is a one and done shot which would help mitigate disease in Africa, a country which can't repay the massive costs that are expected of developing a safe universal Ebola virus vaccine. So, vaccine development and funding new uses for generic medication reside as topics that are usually funded by public funds. Wrapping up all this together, the drug development pipeline is very long and complex, and I've made many generalizations about this pipeline. But what we can glean is that there needs to be a cooperation of some kind between private and public funds to keep generating advances in drug technology, among other fields. But as I mentioned, I specialize in biomedical sciences. If we follow the proposal laid out by the OMB, it will slow the flow of that metaphorical river that generates new ideas for industry while not finding a source to supplement that flow of fresh ideas. Since, as for the reasons I've laid out, idea creation isn't really the forte of big companies and to a lesser extent also biotech startups. Not only that, in combination with a recent strategic failure in foreign policy, means that in 2 years' time, there will be a 100% tariff placed on all generic drugs. Generic drugs, or drugs with expired patents, are usually many times cheaper than brand name drugs and account for roughly 90% of the prescriptions that are filled in the United States. So, to understand the sheer insanity of this idea, you have to know that almost all of the world's chemical manufacturing, which is used for scientific purposes, all of those chemicals are produced abroad. So, having a timeline of moving chemical factories domestically within 2 years is a fever dream. Even 10 years is a bit of a stretch. And because of this, drug prices are likely to soar in the coming years unless something is done. And the overall output of new drugs will also slow down because of the decreased enrollment of PhD students. The loss of basic science at the hands of the OMB and tariffs on generic drugs all point to the progress of pharmaceutical companies to come to a screeching halt and for drug prices to remain on the rise. Now, if you are still not convinced that science in America is collapsing, I'm now going to take you behind the scenes of applying for PhD programs and a government grant from NSF so that you can see for yourself what a raging dumpster fire the research community is currently attending to. And as some background, I was set to graduate undergrad in May of 2025. So I started applying to PhD programs finishing in November of 2024 so that I could hopefully enter my PhD right as I was exiting undergrad. Uh, Honestly, I thought I was a shoe in for most programs. And at that point, I had already had 2.5 years of undergraduate research. I was waiting on a publication. I had good grades. I had good letters of recommendation. Basically, everything checked out. And I submitted my applications in November, and all hell broke loose when the current president took over. As soon as he arrived in office, he launched a tit for tat match against Harvard, as I mentioned, freezing $2 billion dollars in research funding, leaving all who relied on this money in limbo, waiting to see if they could continue getting paid to do research that they were already authorized to do by NIH or NSF, all because Harvard didn't want to get rid of its DEI program. Harvard wasn't the only school that was targeted either. Many other schools faced uncertainty, leading to an incredibly rough application cycle ending in April 2025, where I did not end up getting accepted anywhere. And while I don't like to point fingers at people, I'm sure that the uncertainty of grant funding at that time made it much more difficult for schools to pick as many candidates as they would have in years prior. In fact, the university I attended ended up over admitting applicants to a specific program because they misgauged how many people would actually accept the offer that the university gave out. This meant that my university ended up with a cohort size roughly double that of what they would expect from previous cohorts. Because of that, this program at my university had to cease applications for this past round of PhD applications entirely. And they were not the only school to have some programs not be able to, I guess, have PhD applications open this past cycle. Because of the rough cycle, I did everything I could to become a more competitive candidate for the next PhD cycle. I had Quite frankly, I had a pretty rough time finding a STEM related job in my area, so I ended up continuing to work with the professor I worked with in undergrad, post grad, despite the fact that he did not have any money to pay me. So I did get paid for research as an undergraduate researcher, but all of those funding opportunities I secured for myself. And crucially, after I graduated, there wasn't any sort of funding that I could apply for. So, in essence, I have been working without pay for the past year now because funds are so tight, and people in the biotech industry also seem to not be hiring many new workers right now. Although I am lucky at least that my research funding was still available for me to use this past year. Some people haven't been so lucky though, like a friend of mine, for example, who was going to continue studying the gender specific effects of cocaine addiction in mice. However, since the grant had DEI language and used gender to differentiate between potentially undiscovered male and female addiction pathways, his work ended up getting cut, sadly, and he wasn't able to return to his lab post grad. So luckily, at least I could continue doing research after graduating, but on the flip side, I was not getting paid for any of it. So the reason I worked without income was basically just to wow the future PhD committee and just basically tell them that I'm real about all this science stuff, so much so that I also applied for a government research grant alongside doing PhD applications. So applying for this grant would basically just show universities that I am willing to fight for my own funding. And by the end of graduate school, I will likely acquire my own grants to support my own research, and I wouldn't have to be supported by university grants. Because of those reasons, I submitted an application for the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program, or the GRFP. The GRFP is a prestigious grant that mints Nobel laureates roughly every 2 years and supports 3 years of research into whatever topic you find interesting. More importantly, though, the GRFP, historically speaking, has been awarded to scientists who show great promise, not necessarily with the project they propose, but just as the researcher themselves that they are. For example, in my proposal that I wrote up, it was a mock up of the research that I would have done should I have continued doing research at my undergraduate institution. This is what my proposal ended up looking like with all the pretty figures and all of that good stuff. But the twist is, though, that had I have gotten awarded that grant, the GRFP, I could have taken it with me to any institution that accepted me into their PhD program. In fact, I didn't even apply to my undergraduate institution for their PhD programs. So there was no way I would ever do this research proposal. But NSF, they don't care about that. They were more interested in whether I can think like a scientist or show potential for growth to become an important figure that is entrusted to conduct science using government funds. And that is how the NSF GRFP should work, at least. However, as you'll see in a bit, that is no longer how it seems to be working at these governmental agencies, and it certainly won't be how they are operating should the OMB get their way. Now, immediately I knew that something was off with the GRFP applications because usually the GRFP applications are due early November. So, sensibly, the instructions for each year's grant application would get published in July so that researchers have enough time to do their writing and all of that and make sure to include all of the criteria that NSF want for the grant proposals. However, this year it did not release in July, instead in late September, giving applicants only a month and a half to ensure that they submitted a proposal by the deadline. Now, looking at years past, they were always pretty consistent with the release date of the solicitation or basically the instructions for the grant submission. However, this year they were way off. Funnily enough, the day that they finally posted the solicitation in late September, I went to check what was up basically immediately after they posted the new solicitation, because at that point I had been writing my grant blind, so I was really excited to see what the guidelines actually were. And to my surprise, I saw that on the site they also had a banner on the side that said that they had this only on the website for the first day or two before they removed it, but they said that they were expecting to give out 1 to 2,500 GRFPs, which is a pretty wide range considering that in recent memory, around 2,000 GRFPs are given out per year. So apart from that, there were further controversies with this year's GRFP, namely that they changed the regulations such that second-year PhD students could no longer apply for the grant anymore, despite reassuring second-year PhD students last year that they would be able to apply for this year's. So this action further limits opportunities for early career scientists to support their own growth into becoming rigorous thinkers. Alongside the strain that the OMB is placing on the scientific community, there is now further restrictions on how PhD students can fund their work through NSF. For the GRFP application itself, they also made all applicants submit an official redacted transcript, which, by the way, took me forever to redact. And they had to submit this redacted transcript right next to where you would input your unredacted information into text boxes right next to the redacted transcript that you had to submit. So originally, they had different wording in the solicitation, which made it seem like you could use an unofficial transcript, which was allowed in years prior. However, afterwards, NSF did have to send out an email to applicants saying that indeed you do need an official redacted transcript for whatever reason. My guess is that they wanted to add even more bureaucracy to the grant application system so that scientists are more inclined to just give up on research, but that is just a guess. Luckily, there were a record number of GRFPs handed out this year. However, the trend in who is getting accepted to win these grant proposals is becoming a bit scary. To look at this in past years' GRFP grants that were awarded, I looked at this article by Dr. Brenner and Dr. Muller Parker. Dr. Muller Parker used to be the lead program director of the GRFP when she was at NSF. And together they wrote this editorial in which they claim that NSF has strayed from their agenda of funding the researcher, not the research. And I wholeheartedly agree with them. The first signs of cracks in NSF came in 2020 when their application instructions for the 2021 fiscal year included areas of interest that the government would like to fund over others, and basically blatantly overriding past precedent of going after basic research and great researchers, not the ideas themselves. There was public outcry, and this criteria was removed as part of the application, but it made its way back into the 2024 as well as the 2025 application. 2024 was an interesting year since normally NSF hands out roughly 2,000 awards yearly. However, when they were deciding the winners for 2025, only 1,000 proposals were picked, and a disproportionate amount of researchers were given honorable mentions compared to previous years instead. Of those who got rejected, a higher proportion of them were people studying biosciences, psychology, and geosciences, which the authors note are women dominated fields, which it might be a coincidence, but you never know. Due to the public backlash of only these 1,000 GRFPs being given out in April of 2025, 500 more were eventually given out 2 months later. And these 500 extra GRFPs were majorly going to students in computer engineering to support research into, quote, critical and emerging technologies through the direct intervention of the White House, end quote, said by the acting director of NSF at the time. 85% of the second round late GRFP awards that were handed out to students all had the labeled area of interest of AI or machine learning. Despite the buzz of AI and the secondary 500 GRFPs that were awarded, no proposals that mixed biological sciences with AI or machine learning earned any awards. Instead, these awards were almost solely given to computer engineers. This paints a pretty clear picture that the government is trying to exert its force to control what research is being done, in this case, working to improve AI and directly contradicting the philosophy that NSF should fund the researcher, not the project. This worries me, especially in the context of AI, since the government is now contributing to the AI bubble, dare I say. While yes, AIs could lead to more productivity in the future, you need to place those AIs in productive people's hands in order to create productive things. Just letting computer scientists tinker with AI and not let scientists use it to discover new things is counterproductive. If we develop more modern AIs, there will be a lack of experts to test these models in academic fields and find productive uses of this technology. One way in which AI could be subsidized for good, if that even exists, is to use it for furthering our understanding of the biomedical sciences. But biomedical researchers are currently struggling to get grants which let them use AI in government funded research, not because their research isn't worth it. There's still an unimaginable amount of stuff to research in the biomedical sciences space these days. It's a blatant favoritism to develop a technology that has yet to prove itself as necessary for throwing all of this money at. In fact, why are we developing better models? There's years, decades maybe, of work to be done, even if our progression of AI models ceases entirely today. Now more than ever, we are seeing big tech companies switch from models like Claude and ChatGPT to open source, less expensive models, since it is still uncertain whether the cream of the crop, more expensive models truly will make industries more productive. There is certainly a lot of buzz around the idea that AI might not be as profitable as we are thought to believe right now, but we'll have to see ultimately how that shakes out. But one of the reasons why AI isn't as productive as we thought might be that there's only computer engineers handling AI, at least as I see it. I'm sure if you let this technology to be freely tested by scientists and other such experts in their field, it could help make new discoveries. But currently, that grant money isn't being distributed fairly, so that could happen. In fact, just a couple days ago, it was announced that $200 billion dollars of university funding will be diverted to solo scientists to, quote, get rid of bureaucracy, end quote, and try to develop AIs even faster with less guardrails and further stressing the PhD pipeline, which is already seeing historic declines in enrollment rates. Should the government succeed in subsidizing potentially the next dot-com bubble, we will be stuck with the best AI and a lack of scientists to do novel, interesting work with it. And we will thus develop less technologies as a result because we chose AI over researchers. Going back to NSF, though, it is very short sighted the way in which NSF is moving right now with their diversion of public money to fund the creation of more expensive models, which less and less people will use. There was an improvement in GRFP awards this past cycle with 2,500 GRFPs being awarded. However, you can see that the proportion of biomedical researchers getting grants, and for most fields for that matter, just now reached the levels that they were at in 2024, with engineering fields really seeing the only increase in grant proposals being given to them. All that is to say, and as you probably have guessed, I did not get awarded a GRFP during this application cycle, although I will say that I am extremely happy and proud of all of those researchers who did get awarded the GRFP, and I hope that this money lets you become an even better researcher. However, I am still worried about the continued security of government grants in the future. One reason being, weeks following NSF's decision and awarding these GRFPs to applicants, just weeks after that, the entire board of highly decorated scientists, which determine the ideals for grant submission every year, abruptly all got fired. And while this does seem shocking, it really shouldn't be, since NSF has basically had no acting director since April 25th of 2025. So for a bit over a year now, and since late April, there are officially no officials running NSF and their multi-billion dollar budget. When you add this on top of the many spats that the government is having with the research community, it certainly does seem like the OMB will become the de facto ruler of the scientific world, but I do have hope for this situation. While the courts do move slow, they have been giving many victories to scientists, such as reversing numerous grant freezes, reversing money that was cut from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as the National Center for Atmospheric Research, alongside also recently reversing a push to end government money and funding ocean observatories that study our climate. It seems like most of what the OMB wants to achieve is illegal or will be deemed so once these rules pass. It is extremely likely that if the OMB implements these rules that I mentioned prior in this video, they will have their pants suit off of them. And in that time of getting sued and hopefully scientists in theory winning a majority of those lawsuits, there will still be mayhem to the institutional science across America. And depending on the severity of these consequences, it could lead to the downfall of American science as we know it. So while it is tough to stay positive in these troubled times, remember this: the only reason that the president is going after scientists is because he knows for a fact that they are the only group of people who he won't be able to bully into approving all of his wildest conspiracy theories, and instead will remain loyal to unbiased scientific progress. It is important that we stay strong and continue to stand on the right side of history, no matter how dire and no matter how uncomfortable things may seem right now. And to end on a lighter note, luckily I did end up getting accepted into a PhD program this past cycle, so I will be starting PhD school soon. However, I guess we'll see how long that should last, because if the government does find this video, I'm sure the OMB wouldn't be happy of my criticisms that I laid out. But what is important here is that we know what is going on with our government and science at large. And as someone who loves science, I am blessed that I got the opportunity to share my thoughts with you on the matter today. And for the sake of this video, I won't mention where I'm going to get my PhD, but rest assured, I am still hoping for the return to the scientific prowess that was regarded worldwide up until the arrival of the current president. But as always, I hope this video informed you about the current crisis that American science faces, and I hope it will make you side with scientists when it comes time to vote in the midterms. But as always, I hope you have enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.